Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Let's stand to our feet. We're going to enter into a time of worship. If you're new here, that's just a time of singing and singing these songs that mean a lot to us. So something that's been on my heart recently is that it's so easy for us to just, sing these songs and listen to the music and just feel like, yeah, we're really engaging with God. But I feel like God desires something more for us. He wants to know our hearts, and he wants to get to know you personally. So I want to encourage us not to just sit back and just sing these songs, but to actually think about the words that they say. And I don't know what you're going through necessarily, but something that's really important to me is that it feels like these words are so powerful and they're so easy just to let them pass by. So really try to focus on these. And sometimes in my life, it feels like God's distant or God's far away, but I feel like those are the times when we need to lean into God. Those times that it feels like we're in a desert, that's when we have to push in and lean in and grab onto what God has for us. Because God is the living water, and he's there to fill every single desire that you guys have, and I have, even our church. So let's really focus on that today. I really know that God is working in the lives of our church and in the life of me, and I know that he's going to work in your hearts today, this morning. So try not to hold anything back. Maybe it's scary, it's uncomfortable, but maybe that's like singing a little bit louder than you're used to, or raising your hand in worship, or maybe using this time as a time of prayer for yourself. But whatever it is, whatever you need to do to allow God to work in this space, I want to encourage you guys to do that. Let's pray. God, thank you so much for this opportunity that we get to be here, God, and to sing these songs and be in this place with these people around us, God. We are so thankful for this opportunity that we have to worship you freely in this place, God. We love you so much, and we invite you into this place. In Jesus' name we pray.
Walking around these walls, I thought by now they'd fall, but you have never failed me yet. Waiting for change to come, knowing the battle's won, for you have never failed me yet. Your promise still stands. Great is your faithfulness, your faithfulness. I'm still in your hands. This is my confidence. You never failed me yet. wasn't holding you up, so there's nothing I can do to let you down. It doesn't take a trophy to make you proud. I'll never be more loved than I am right now.
Going through a storm, but I won't go down. I hear your voice carried in the rhythm of the wind to call me out. You would cross an ocean, so I wouldn't drown. You've never been closer than you are right now. You are Jireh. You are enough. Jireh. You are enough. And I will be content, even in every circumstance. You are Jireh. You are enough. Forever enough. Always enough. Always more than enough. Oh, sing forever, forever enough. Always enough. Always more than enough.
I don't wanna forget how I feel right now at the mountaintop. I can see so clear when it's all about.
So stay by my side when the sun goes down. Don't wanna forget how I feel right now. Jireh, you are enough. Oh, Jireh, you are enough. And I will be content, even in every circumstance. Oh, you are Jireh. You are enough. Forever enough. Always enough. Always more than enough. Oh, forever. Always enough. Always more than enough. All right, let's sing this out together. I'm already loved. I'm already chosen. I know who I am. I know what you've spoken. I'm already loved more than I can imagine. And that is enough. I'm already loved. I'm already chosen. I know who I am. us how he is calling us home to live a life of purpose in him. So just as Dakota said, wherever we're at today, let's sing this out with all we got. Here we go. You know I had my doubts. I thought the fire went out, but the old winds are blowing again. Here we go, come on. Thought I had lost my way. I'm sure I will again someday. There's a whisper calling again. Let's sing this out. This is the sound of a child coming home. Hallelujah. This is the sound of a welcome prodigal. Hallelujah. I thought I was too far gone, but you always leave the light on. Praise God, praise God, praise God. I'm coming home. I was miles away. Somehow my vision changed. You've been with me all along. Oh, you with us. Took me a long, long time to finally realize that you never, ever, ever shut the door. This is the sound of a child coming home. Hallelujah. This is the song of a welcome prodigal. Hallelujah. I thought I was too far gone, but you always leave the light on. Praise God, praise God, praise God. For those who are afraid to come, there is no fear in perfect love. For those who don't know where to start, he always meets us where we are. For those with just a little faith is all it takes. He's calling. Come on, sing this out. He's calling. If you got caught up in religion's game, then let him show you the real thing. For the skeptic still in search of truth, he'll bring that child out of you. Oh, what are you still waiting for? Standing at an open door. He's calling. He's calling. This is the sound of a child coming home. Hallelujah. This is the sound of a welcome prodigal. Hallelujah. This is the sound of a child coming home. Hallelujah. This is the sound of a welcome prodigal. Hallelujah. I thought I was too far gone, but you always leave the light on. Praise God, praise God, praise God. Praise God, praise God, praise God. I'm coming home. All right, we're so glad to hear you guys. Go ahead and have a seat.
What's up, FCC? I'm Morgan, this is Jake, and we run the youth programs here at the church. Now, we were supposed to be at winter camp this weekend. Unfortunately, due to the beautiful snow you see behind us on the mountains, we weren't able to make it up there. So instead, we're here on this roof filming for you. Now, shout out to all of our volunteers who took time off of work, were planning on taking time away from their families to come up and volunteer with us. We appreciate you so much, but there's more ways to volunteer than just on our youth team.
Yeah, you can get involved with our kids ministry on the weekends. We have music, we have production, we have our guest services team, we have our food pantry. There are a ton of ways to get involved here at FCC, and we can't do those things without you. So if you're interested in that, go to fcchb.com/recap, and you can find out more information about those roles.
Well, with that being said, it's time to transition into our new series called The Gospel.
Morning, everybody. Good to see you all. Thank you so much for being here. Like Jake and Morgan just said, we're starting this brand new series, and it's called The Gospel. And if you've been around churches very much, you've probably heard this word used a lot. The word gospel gets used a lot in churches, gets used a lot in different ministry settings, gets used by a lot of different Christians. And I grew up, I've talked about this before, but I grew up within church. I've been in church my whole life. And so the whole time I was growing up, I would hear this word, gospel, gospel, and the gospel was like important, and it was the center of Christian faith, and I was always taught like, hey, this is what the gospel is, and the gospel is something that within Christian context, we preach it, we teach it, we proclaim it, we believe it, and it saves us. And so the gospel is this word that gets used a bunch, and it's central to everything about Christianity and Christian faith and the church. But here's the question that we really want to kind of wrestle with. What is the gospel? All right, like again, we use it all the time. We use it, but what is it and what does it really mean? See, again, going to church, I was always kind of taught like, hey, this is what the gospel is. And there was this definition of gospel that I heard over and over again from various different people and places or even read it. But when I was told what the gospel was, when I read what the gospel was, it was kind of this really narrowly defined thing. Like, this is what the gospel is. It's this kind of narrowly defined thing. But as I got older and I began to like read the New Testament, and the word gospel starts getting used in the New Testament by Jesus. He uses it first, and then his followers pick up on it, and it's the word that Jesus uses to describe what he's doing, but then his followers use it to describe his life. And as I began to read when they would talk about the gospel, and when they would use the word gospel, and when they would preach or teach about the gospel, it became really clear to me that like what they were talking about when they said gospel isn't what I was taught what the gospel was. That when the New Testament writers would write about the gospel, it was so much bigger and better than what I had been taught. And so I think what happens a lot of times is we take this idea, this word gospel that is such an important part of the New Testament and the life of Jesus, and we kind of reduce it down to something less than what it truly is. And so what we want to do in this series is we kind of want to explore what is the gospel? What is it really all about? And here's what I promise you, that I don't know your faith background, I don't know your church background. Maybe this is your first time in a church. Maybe you've had bad experiences in a church. Maybe you've had bad experiences of the word gospel. But here's what I want to promise you right from the very beginning, is that the gospel, when the New Testament writers use the word gospel, when Jesus uses the word gospel, that idea, that concept is so much bigger and better than how we typically use it. And so over the next few weeks, we're going to unpack what really is the gospel all about. Now, the word gospel that we translate into English as gospel actually comes from a Greek word. The New Testament's originally written in Greek. And the Greek word that we translate gospel is actually the word euangelion. Actually, if you just translate it letter for letter, it's where we get the term evangelism. But the word euangelion actually means good news. If you translate it, it means good news. And originally, it's actually a military term. Because back in the day, if you kind of go back to like the days of the Roman Empire, when you would go to war with someone and you would win, you had to figure out a way to let people know that you would win. Because they didn't have like Facebook or social media, so you couldn't log on and there wasn't this headline of, hey, we won. And so in your kingdom, in your empire, how do you let everyone know this good news that, hey, you all know we were at war, but we won the war? And how do you let people like in remote villages know? Well, what you do is you send out messengers or even heralds. And you send them out and you say, hey, I need you to go everywhere and I need you to make this announcement. I need you to proclaim that we won. And so these messengers and heralds would go out to all corners of the kingdom, all corners of the empire. They would get to towns or villages, wherever they were going, and they would stand up in a place where everyone could see them, everyone could hear them, and they would make this proclamation. Hey, we won. We were victorious. Now, the interesting thing about the term gospel is typically when it's used in a plural setting. So there's not just one piece of good news. It's almost like there's good newses. And the reason they would use it in the plural setting is because when you announced a victory, usually the announcement of that victory had like multiple good implications for it. It wasn't just that we won. Yes, we won. That's the announcement. That's the good news. But because we won, our enemy is gone. So we're no longer threatened. And maybe our enemy had conquered us and oppressed us and enslaved us. So we're not slaves anymore. And we're going to be free. And maybe the enemy had laid siege to us and it affected the economy and we cut off water supplies or food routes. Well, now we're getting food, we're getting water. Our soldiers, who are our husbands, our sons, our friends, they're all coming home. So the announcement, the gospel, the good news was, hey, we had this military victory. But there are all these different implications that because we won, there's now all these good newses, things that are going to happen. And so this is the word that Jesus begins to use to talk about himself. If you look at the book of Mark, what we often call the Gospel of Mark, that this is kind of how Jesus begins, that his life is about good news. And then again, after Jesus, his earliest followers, this is the word they continue to use to talk about Jesus and what his whole life is all about, that his life is good news. And so throughout the last 2,000 years, it is the word that Christians have used to continue to talk about Jesus, that his life, what he did, what he accomplished is good news. But here's what I find, it's just ironic. I just find this really, really ironic. A lot of times, and maybe you've had this experience too, a lot of times when I hear people talk about the good news, when I hear people talk about the gospel, it doesn't sound like good news. You ever heard someone and they're up there and they're preaching the gospel, and as you're listening to them, you're like, yeah, this just doesn't sound good. It sounds more like judgment and condemnation. A couple weeks ago, my family, we took a trip to New York City. And it was, my daughter had always wanted to go. It was like her dream trip. I had been one time when I was like in high school, hadn't been in years. And so we're like, well, let's go. Let's make a long weekend out of it. And so we did. We went on a holiday weekend. We just had a blast. We had a great time. Went around and did all the New York City things. And one night we're walking through Times Square. And again, it was a holiday weekend, and so it was jam-packed. I think Times Square is one of those places it's always crazy, but on the evening of a holiday weekend, I think it was even more crazy, and it was just jam-packed full of people. There's people everywhere. And when you're in Times Square, it's like overload because you have all these giant screens and the advertisements are going on these screens and there's people cooking at carts, and so the smells are overwhelming and all these people scattered all over the place. And in the middle of all of it, as we're walking through one part of Times Square, there is a guy who is preaching. And this is not a picture that I took. Okay, I didn't take a picture of the guy preaching. I just Googled Times Square preacher, and this is the picture that came up. And this is kind of what it looked like with the guy preaching. That in the midst of this chaos of people, you had this one guy who was preaching, and you had all these different people that pretty much everyone was steering clear of them. You ever notice when someone's street preaching, like no one is within like a 10-foot radius of them? And so you had people, some people were laughing, and some people are just like kind of disgusted, but this is kind of what the scene looked like. Now, what was interesting as I walked by is when I was a kid, I remember going places and you would have people that were like street preachers. But back in the day, street preachers would use bullhorns because that's all you had, right? That's how you had to amplify your voice. And bullhorns, really, if we're honest, they're just not very effective. Like, they're kind of cheap things. They only project sound one way. And when someone's like yelling at you through a bullhorn, you literally only pick up like every fourth word. It's like, no, Jesus, hell. Like, you don't even really know what's going on. You're just like, okay. This guy, though, the guy that we saw, he had this incredibly beautiful setup, actually. He had battery-powered speakers. So they're like these big speakers. I mean, they're like this big, they're big. And he's got these different speakers, and they're pointed in different directions, and he has a wireless mic. So as he's preaching, you can literally hear everything that he's saying. Every word. I look by, I'm like, man, I'm impressed. Technology's come a long way from the bullhorn to this like elaborate battery-powered sound system. And it's funny because we're walking by, and he's talking mostly, again, we only walked by him for a few minutes, so I could only overhear maybe 2 or 3 minutes of what he was saying. But most of what he was saying was rooted in wickedness and evil and corruption and judgment. But he also kept insisting that in the midst of all of this wickedness and evil and corruption, there was good news. And what he was sharing was good news. As we're walking by and we're listening to this guy, both my kids lean in and they go, Dad, would you ever preach like that? I was like, no. But we're listening to him. And again, as we walk away and as his voice kind of fades into the background, I'm still hearing him say these words, judgment, wickedness, evilness. And he shared a few specific things that he saw as especially corrupt and evil. But again, he kept insisting that there's good news, there's good news. But I just walked away with this feeling in my stomach like, you keep saying it's good news, but it doesn't sound like good news. It sounds more like judgment. It sounds more like condemnation, which I think is why everyone's avoiding you. Because you're sitting there yelling at people about this good news, but it's not really good news. And I know some people would push back and say, well, the reason it's not good news is because these people don't believe. If these people believed, it would be good news, but the reason it's not good news is because they don't believe. But again, I don't think that's the case, because, again, if you go back to the New Testament, when the New Testament writers would talk about the good news, and even when the New Testament writers would record like speeches or messages or sermons that were given by people in the New Testament, when they're saying, hey, this is what so-and-so said, they would share the gospel. They would share the good news of Jesus. And the earliest followers of Jesus were very well aware of the fact that some people would respond positively to Jesus and some people wouldn't. Some people would, we would use the language, some people would accept Jesus, some people would believe in Jesus, and some people wouldn't. But for the earliest Christians, someone's view or opinion or belief about Jesus did not affect the nature of the gospel. It was good news whether or not you believed it. It was good news whether or not you accepted it. See, for us, the gospel's kind of like, it's only good news if you believe it. There's like this contingent. It's good news, but if you believe it. If you don't believe it, it's actually bad news because you're going to burn in hell. But when you look at the New Testament, their proclamation of the gospel is, regardless of how you respond to Jesus, regardless of what you believe about Jesus, what I am telling you is good news. It's good news for everybody. And so as we start this kind of series on the gospel, I want to start with this week by talking about how we get the gospel wrong. Because I think really in a lot of ways in just kind of our culture and the way we've been shaped within a lot of churches and within a lot of ministry settings, we have this kind of reduced version of the gospel that comes across as only conditional good news. And so I want to kind of zoom out and say, what really is the gospel about, and what is it about the gospel that we get wrong that only kind of makes it conditional? And why for Jesus, and why for the writers and the speakers in the New Testament, why is Jesus good news no matter what you think or believe about him? The Apostle Paul is a guy who writes a big chunk of the New Testament. And most of Paul's, actually really all Paul's writings in the New Testament are letters that he writes to churches. Paul's actually the guy that's most credited with taking the gospel out into the larger Roman Empire. He travels all over the Mediterranean world, he shares the gospel, he starts churches, and he writes a lot of letters to these churches, helping them figure out, what does it mean to be a Christian? You know, what does it mean to live out the Christian faith? What does it mean to embody who Jesus was and what Jesus did? And what's really generally considered Paul's masterpiece theological letter is the book of Romans. It's the letter that he writes to the church in Rome. It's his unpacking of really this is what Christian faith is all about. And so in Romans, if you look at it, in Romans chapter 1, verses 16 through 17, is really Paul's thesis statement for the rest of the book of Romans. He kind of lays out in there, hey, this is what I'm going to talk about, and then he'll spend the rest of the letter examining it, opening it up, expounding on it. And Paul's thesis statement for Romans is about the gospel. And here's what he says. Romans 1, 16 through 17. He says, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. First to the Jew, then to the Gentile. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. A righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith." And so it's kind of subtle there, and it's easy for us to miss, but right from the beginning, Paul points out something that I think is one of the reasons you and I get the gospel wrong. That if you look at how Paul begins that, Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God. And he goes on, and we're going to look at what he goes on to say, but I want to stop and I want to look at that phrase because that's so important. And I think that's key to one of the things we get wrong about the gospel. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God. See, what Paul understands that I think we have kind of mixed up is that the gospel is not about you or I. It is about God. God is the subject of the gospel. It's about what God is doing. See, what has happened really over the last 1,700 years, if you follow it, is Christianity has kind of turned its focus from being about God to being about us as individuals. That we make Christian faith, it's all about me. Even if you look at how we talk about faith in our cultures. Faith is this personal thing. You can believe whatever you want, and your faith is yours, and it's private. And what is faith about? Faith is about what I believe. Faith is about what you believe. But when you look at the earliest Christians, the earliest followers of Jesus in those first few centuries, they understood that they were not the subject of faith. They were not the subject of the gospel. It was about God. Faith was about God. The gospel was about God. The good news was about God. It was about something that God was doing. Now, what God was doing has implications for us. It has implications for all of creation. But it's not about us. It doesn't center on us. See, Scott McKnight, who's a New Testament scholar, he makes a point. He says, really, a lot of times what we have done with the gospel is we have kind of minimalized the gospel down to being about the plan of salvation. How do I get saved? How do you get saved? And so when someone shares the gospel, someone will stand up there and they'll say, you're a sinner, you're going to go to hell, Jesus died, accept him, and you get to go to heaven. That's the gospel. Now, there's truth to that. I'm not saying it's not true. But if you look at that, that makes it all about you, and that makes it all about me, and the gospel centers around us. And Paul's point here is he goes, no, it's not about us. Again, there are implications for us. We'll get to that. But the first thing we have to understand is the good news is about God. It is about something that God has done. It is about something that God is doing. Now, Paul goes on and he uses two words to talk about the something that God has done and the something that God is doing. He uses the word salvation and righteousness. Salvation literally comes from the word to save. God is saving something. Righteousness means to make right. So God is making something right. So as Paul talks about the gospel, Paul says, listen, the gospel, the good news of what God is doing is that God is saving something by making it right. That's the gospel. And see, that's the first thing. If we want to get the gospel right, we first of all have to pull back and say, okay, it's not about us. I may be an object of the gospel. The gospel may have an effect on me, but I'm not the subject. It's not about me. It is about God. And it is about something that God is doing to save and to make right. So what is it? Probably the clearest explanation that Paul gives of the gospel is actually in 1 Corinthians. If you go to 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is going to, the word he's going to use is he's going to remind the Corinthians. And so 1 Corinthians 15, chapter 15 starts off like this. This is what Paul says. He says, now brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received on and which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you, otherwise you have believed in vain. So Paul introduces this section of the letter and he says, listen, I want to remind you what I've already told you. That for Paul, the gospel is the foundation of Christian faith. He even goes on to say, if the gospel is not the foundation of your Christian faith, your faith is in vain. It means nothing. So Paul is reiterating, listen, the gospel is it's central. It's the foundation on which Christian faith exists. And what Paul tells them is he says, listen, I want to remind you what I've already told you. What you already know. Because this is what's central. And so Paul is now going to go on to remind them of what they already know. He's going to remind them of the gospel. And this is where he lays out, I think, kind of his clearest, most in-depth explanation of what the gospel is. And here's what he says. He says, for what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, foundational, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, that's Peter, and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters. And so here, Paul lays out, again, what we tend to define as this is the core of the gospel. Usually, when we talk about the gospel, when I'm referring to our kind of simplified version of the gospel, we focus on the death, burial, and resurrection. Usually in our context, when someone says, I'm going to share the gospel, they stand up and say, Jesus died, he was buried, he rose again, now you can be forgiven, you can go to heaven. That's typically what we say. And Paul here shares those. Those are the three things he shares: death, burial, and resurrection. These are the core elements of the gospel. You can't have the gospel without the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. It all hinges on that. But I also want us to notice that for Paul, that's the core of it, but that's not all of it. There's more to it than that, because twice, Paul uses this phrase that he repeats twice in this because he wants us to not forget it. As he's talking about death, burial, and resurrection, he uses this phrase, according to the scriptures. And by scriptures, Paul's referring to what you and I would call the Old Testament, the First Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the story of Israel. And so Paul is saying, he goes, listen, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, this is central to the gospel. But you have to understand that the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus happens according to the scriptures. And what Paul is making clear to the church in Corinth in this case is Paul's saying, listen, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, it's not like it came out of nowhere. It's not like it just suddenly appeared. It's not like God was just sitting up in heaven doing nothing for a couple thousand years and then just one day decided like, hey, I'm going to do something today. I'm going to go down here and I'll die and resurrect and it'll all be good. And Paul's saying, no. God was up to something before Jesus. And what Jesus did is a part of this bigger thing that God was already doing. That's the according to the scriptures part. That yes, it centers on Jesus, mainly his death, burial, and resurrection. But that was part of something that God was already up to. And so the gospel is, yes, it's centered on Jesus, but it's bigger than Jesus because you can't understand Jesus and his life, death, and resurrection and what it means apart from this bigger story of which Jesus is the culmination of which Jesus is the climax of, that you have to look according to the scriptures. What's happening according to the scriptures? What is it that God is up to according to the scriptures? And so when you go back and you look at the story of the Old Testament, when you look at the story of Israel, you see this kind of overarching story that really begins with creation. And God creates the world and he puts human beings in the world as his image bearers. We were created to reflect God's character to the world. But the biblical story goes on to describe that the world is not as it should be. That there's something wrong with the world. That the way things are, this is not how it's supposed to be. And really, I don't think any one of us here, I don't think any of us need someone to tell us that. We all know when we look around the world, regardless of our faith, regardless of our beliefs, regardless of our philosophical, theological position, most of us would look around the world and go, yeah, this is not how things should be. This is not how things are supposed to be. It should look different. It should be different. That's really what the first 11 chapters of the Bible are about, Genesis 1 through 11. That how did we get to the world in which we live? That this world is not what it should be. And at the heart of this world not being the way it should be is really human choice. Like we were the ones put in charge of creation. We were the ones who were tasked with reflecting God's character to the world. But instead of doing that, time and time again, we make choices that are self-centered, that are about us and what we want and what we desire. And when we do that, that harms the rest of creation. See, when you look at it, we're going to look at this next week, but the story of creation centers on these two people, Adam and Eve. The whole point of Adam and Eve is not like to read that and get angry at these two people. The whole point of that is that that's what keeps happening. That's why the world is the way that it is. Not because that happened one time, but because that keeps happening over and over again, almost daily in years of my life. We make these choices that negatively impact the rest of creation. They negatively impact the people around us. They negatively impact the physical space in which we live. And the world is not what it should be. But God, out of his love, does not abandon his creation, but commits to, no, I'm going to make the world right. I'm not going to abandon this to just go down in a blaze of glory. I'm committed to saving this creation and to making it right. And ironically, for some bizarre reason of which I have no idea, this will be the first question I will ask God one day, is his plan for making the world right is to work with people. The very people that screwed it up in the first place. Like God comes to this guy, Abram, and his wife, Sarah, and he says, listen, this whole thing's jacked up. I'm going to make it right, and you're going to help me. Out of you is going to become this people, and these people are going to show the world this is what creation is supposed to look like. This is how full life can be when you live the way you were supposed to live, when you live in a way that reflects the character and the goodness and the love and the justice and the mercy of God. I mean, God could have just fixed it himself. It would have been way easier, but for whatever reason, he didn't. His answer to the fact that people have screwed up the world is, hey, now you're going to work with me to fix this mess. We're going to fix it together. And so he creates this people of Israel that have this purpose that is not about themselves. Israel does not exist for their own benefit, but for the benefit of the world, to show the world what God is like, to show the world the way life can be. Now, Israel does that remarkably well in a few instances. But by and large, they don't quite get it right. And so Israel's story really ends with defeat, conquering, and exile. So when you get to the end of that Old Testament, it's really easy to look at it and go, well, that failed. And a lot of times what we'll do is we'll say, well, Israel failed, so God just kind of wiped it all clean, and then he started a brand new plan with Jesus. And this is where Paul says, no, he didn't. that Jesus is actually the fulfillment of Israel, that everything God said he was going to do in Israel, he does through Jesus. Because where does Jesus come out of? Jesus comes out of Israel. And Jesus, if you read through his life, sometimes he will make these really bizarre statements to people who are not Israelites. He'll be like, look, I'm really just here for Israel. Now, it's not that he doesn't like people who are outside of Israel. He is the one who paves the way for like reaching out to Samaritans and Gentiles and people who are not Jewish or part of Israel. But Jesus also focuses in on Israel. And even Jesus, when he launches the church out of the remnant of Israel. Why? Because this is not some brand new thing. This is a part of what God has been doing since he first called Abram and Sarah. That it reaches its culmination and its climax in the person of Jesus. That Jesus is the embodiment and the fulfillment of Israel. He is going to accomplish what Israel has yet to accomplish. And ultimately, he does that through his death, burial, and resurrection. And after his resurrection, this is when he launches the church. And like we said, the church is launched out of the remnant of Israel. Now, it becomes more than that because Paul travels all over the Roman world and starts all these Gentile churches. But out of the remnant of Israel comes the church. And the church, it's different, but in some ways it's given kind of the same task of Israel, that you are now going to work with me. You are going to help me make this world right. You are witnesses to what God did in the person of Jesus, because the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus is the means by which God is making the world right. And see, this is another thing that I think is super important, that we kind of simplify, that we tend to look at the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. We look at it almost as transactional. That we messed up, we sinned, and somebody had to pay the price. Jesus paid the price with his death, so now we get to go to heaven. I'm not saying that's not true. There's truth to that. But again, if you look at the gospel as it's shared in the New Testament, the death of Jesus is about a lot more than you and I getting to go to heaven. Because if you read the New Testament, Jesus dies, he buries, he raises again. And one thing I think it's important to understand too is that we, like a lot of times I think we look back on people that came before us and we just think, oh, well, those people were dumb and naive. They just didn't understand things. They didn't know anything. You know, they just believed people came back from the dead. Okay, people 2,000 years ago didn't understand Wi-Fi. I get that. Like that would be a weird concept. But they weren't dumb enough to think people just come back from the dead. This is why, notice how when Paul ends this, he talks about the resurrection. What does he say? He says, listen, he appeared to Peter, he appeared to the 12, he appeared to more than 500 other people. The reason Paul says that is because Paul knows, look, this is a difficult thing to believe. I get it. So if you want to talk to somebody that saw it, here's a list of them. Go talk to these people. And they can tell you what they saw. And so Jesus, through his death, burial, and resurrection, he overcomes death. That's at the heart of it, right? He conquers death. Death had always been like the ultimate symbol of evil. It was the one thing that you could just never come back from, right? Death had the final word. Death had the final say. Ultimately, you would say death was in charge. Death ruled. Because whatever has ultimate power is what's in charge, and death has ultimate power until Jesus overcomes death. Now, all of a sudden, there's something that's more powerful than death. Now, here's a part of the gospel that I think we forget a lot. So Jesus resurrects. He hangs around on earth for about another month. He gathers with his disciples one more time. He gives them some parting instructions. Part of those parting instructions is he makes a statement. He says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Then he ascends into heaven, promising to return one day. That ascension is crucial for the early followers of Jesus. We a lot of times don't give it a really much of a thought. It's just like, oh, he went away promising to come back. But ascension, what happens in ascension? Ascension is how someone becomes royalty. That's what we say, right? You ascend to the throne. And just before Jesus' ascension, what does he say? All authority in heaven and on earth has been given for me. When Jesus ascends into heaven, his earliest followers understood that this is him ascending into heaven as the king. And why is he the king? Because he conquered death. He overcame death. He's now in charge. He has all authority. He is now king over the earth. This is what Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection are about. It's about him in God in the flesh, in the person of Jesus, reclaiming his authority over all of creation. It's about how he becomes king again. Now, yes, part of that is forgiveness and redemption for you and I. But the reason he does it is to become king. This is how God becomes king of the world. And this is huge for the earliest followers of Jesus. This is what they understand. This is the good news. That God, in and through Jesus, has once again become the king of the world. And this is how he's making the world right. How can he make the world right? Because he's the king. And when you're the king, you can do what you want. You have the authority. You have the power. You're the one in charge. In conquering death, Jesus claims authority and becomes king. And now he's making the world right, and he sends out the church to partner with him, to work with him, as he, through the presence of his Spirit in the life of his church, continues to go about making the world right, promising that one day he will come back and finish that work. This is why, even if you go on in 1 Corinthians 15, if you skip ahead some verses to verse 24, Paul talks about this. It's a little bit confusing, but just kind of listen, don't get lost in the little details, pay attention to the big theme. Paul says, then the end will come when he, that's Jesus, hands over the kingdom to God the Father, after he's destroyed all dominion, authority, and power. For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. When he's done this, then the Son himself will be made subject to him who put everything under him, so that God may be all in all. And again, you could write a whole PhD dissertation on everything that's in there. But I share this because I want to get to the point that this is what Paul's getting at. Paul's saying, listen, the whole thing, the death, burial, and resurrection, according to the scriptures, what that's all about is this is how God is once again becoming king. And this is the means by which God is making the world right. The death, burial, resurrection, and ascension, they all kind of go together. This is the point. Again, the point of Jesus raising from the dead is not just so you and I can go to heaven. I'm not saying that it doesn't have implications for us, because remember, the whole point of the good news, the whole point of the gospel is there is multiple implications. There's multiple ramifications, that because of this good news, here's all these other things that happen, and we'll get to that. But remember, gospel is an announcement. It is a proclamation that something has happened, and because something has happened, this is the way N.T. Wright says it, the world is now fundamentally a different place. And this is the announcement that the earliest Christians are making, is that because of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, something has happened by which now everything is different. And N.T. Wright goes on even further, and he says, when we make the proclamation of the gospel that something has happened that has fundamentally changed the world, that also includes with it this promise that because something already happened in Jesus in the past, that also means that something is going to happen in the future. That what he began, he is going to finish. And see, this is where the story becomes so important, because the story is the story of the faithfulness of God to do ultimately what he says he's going to do. And so this is what gives us hope for the future. That what happened in the past, that Jesus overcame death, is this promise and this indication of, hey, this is where it's all going. Paul will talk about Jesus being the first fruits. And see, this is why the writers, the speakers, the preachers in the New Testament, this is why they can refer to the gospel as good news no matter what you or I believe. Because what they're saying is, listen, doesn't matter what you believe, doesn't matter what you think, the world is not as it should be. There's something at its very core, at its very essence, there's something wrong with the world. Things aren't the way that they're supposed to be. But the good news is that God, through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, has become king, and he's making the world right. That's the proclamation. That's the good news. And whatever you or I think about that, whatever we believe, again, I'm not saying it's not important for us, but that's kind of like one of those secondary ramifications. The good news is that, yes, the world is jacked up. But God, out of his love, through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, he's making the world right. See, part of the reason we get the gospel wrong is because we simplify it down and we divorce it from this larger story. We make it just this transactional thing, and when it's transactional, the good news depends on whether I accept it or not. But to really be good news, I've heard it said this way, it's either good news for everybody or it's good news for nobody. And when the New Testament writers, when the New Testament speakers and preachers, when they would share the good news, it was this proclamation to the world that Yahweh, the God of Israel, had not given up, and he loved his creation so much that he was making it right through his own death, burial, and resurrection. That the world was not going, this is why they were communities of hope. They weren't communities of despair. They didn't sit around and go, oh, the world sucks, culture sucks, society sucks. No, they're like, no, God is alive and he's making the world right. And we can bring hope and we can bring life because this is good news. No matter what you and I think, this is good news. And so as we go through kind of this series of the Gospels, we talk more about the gospel because what we're going to do is we're going to unpack that larger story and we're going to try to understand what are the elements, the defining elements of this larger story that help us get a better grip on the gospel. We put together like a definition of gospel. And this is not a perfect definition of gospel. I put this together. I'm not a scholar or a theologian, so I'm not saying this is the ultimate definition of the gospel. I'm just saying this is one that I think is going to be helpful for us as we work through it. And here it is. Here's our definition of gospel. The good news that in fulfillment of Israel's story, Jesus has become king and is making the world right. That's the gospel. The way that Paul talks about the gospel, the way that Peter preaches about the gospel, the way it's talked and written about in the New Testament. This is what they're getting at. Now, yes, it has implications for us. That yes, the reason we can be forgiven, the reason that we can be restored, the reason that we can be given life now that lasts forever is because of the gospel. That's one of the implications of it. So again, going back to Scott McKnight's language, Scott says we've reduced this down to just how do we overcome sin. Dallas Willard talks about the gospel that we use a lot in our culture. He says it's the gospel, we've made it the gospel of sin management. How do we overcome sin? Sin is a problem. God has to deal with sin. He deals with sin through the person of Jesus. That's a big part of it, but it's not the essence of it. And if we boil it down to just that, we miss kind of the bigger aspect of what it is that God is really doing all around the world. That he's making the world right, that through Jesus he has become king and he's making the world right. And so the only way to understand Jesus fully, and the only way to understand even what the church is all about, what we're supposed to do, is to understand this larger story of the gospel. Because again, Paul, in a letter he writes to Timothy, here's what he says to Timothy. I love this. He defines the gospel again. He says, remember Jesus Christ, raised from the dead, descended from David. This is my gospel. Paul says, yes, central to the gospel, Jesus resurrected. There is no good news without the resurrection of Jesus. Paul will say in other places, if Jesus didn't resurrect, our faith is useless. So it centers on that, centers on resurrection. But you also have to remember that the guy who resurrected was from Israel. Because these two things are connected. They're not separate. And if you divorce them, if you make them two different things, if you make them two separate things, you will miss the bigger picture of what it is that God has been up to. For now, at this point, thousands of years. This great thing that God has been doing that began with Abram and his wife Sarah into the founding of Israel, and then out of Israel came into Jesus, and out of Jesus into the church. This is this thing that God has been up to make the world right and to save it. And yes, it centers on the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, but it's bigger than that. And so throughout the next several weeks, we're going to go through not really events. They're not just events. Some of them are events, but kind of the main ideas and concepts that define this gospel story, this larger biblical narrative. And here's this kind of roadmap that we put together. You don't have to remember this. I'm just showing you this so you can kind of see where we're going. These are the things we're going to talk about over the next several weeks. We're going to talk about creation next week, Israel, the temple, the significance of that, the exile, the Messiah, church, and restoration. So again, these aren't all events, they're different concepts, but these are the things. This isn't comprehensive of the entire story of the Bible. It's an overview thing, but in understanding these key elements, we can understand the gospel and what it really means and what it means for us, the implications it has. But in order for us to understand the implications, we have to understand the magnitude of it. Now, if you're listening to this, you're like, this is curious, this is interesting, I want to know more, I don't want to wait. I want to recommend 2 books for you that deal with this exact thing. And they're great books. The first one is called The King Jesus Gospel by Scott McKnight, who's an American scholar. He's a really smart guy. The other one is Simply Good News by N.T. Wright, who's a British scholar. I actually have copies of both these books. These are great books that talk about both of these things. Talk about our tendency to minimize the gospel, but then zooming out and saying, hey, what's really the gospel all about? So if you want one, I would recommend these. I love N.T. Wright. Just in all honesty, he's British. He's a little bit harder to read. McKnight's a little bit easier to read, but they're both great, great books. So you don't have to read these. Just if you want to know more, if you're interested. Anybody want a copy? Anybody? You? Right there. There you go. Anybody else? Over here? Okay, I'm going to try not to hit you. It's the blue sweatshirt right there. Yeah. So ready? Oh! I was close. So there you go. Those are just great books. But as we begin this, as we kind of begin this kind of discussion, this journey through the gospel, here's the thing that I want to make like really clear. we've all probably, I'm sure at some point, regardless of our faith past or history, we've all probably heard the word gospel. And some of us, that's a good word. Some of us, it's probably a negative word because we associate it more with judgment or criticism. But here's just what I want us to understand. The gospel, the way Jesus talked about the gospel, the way Paul proclaimed the good news, the way Peter proclaimed the good news, was so much bigger and better than what most of us tend to think when we think about the gospel. And the cool thing about the gospel is, yes, it was this proclamation that something had happened. It was good news. It was this proclamation that something had happened. But in proclaiming the gospel, it also serves as an invitation to make the gospel my story. That when you proclaim the gospel is the story of God. It's the story of what God is doing through the world that centers on the person of Jesus. But in proclaiming the gospel, Jesus and the followers of Jesus also understood that it was an invitation that, yes, this was God's story, but he was inviting us to be a part of it. That the gospel can become our story as we become a part of what it is that God is doing in the world. Last Saturday, I spent the whole day. This time of year, I always dedicate one day toward this. It's a miserable day, worst day of the year. Some of you probably do this too, but I always have to do it. I did my taxes. I set the day aside. I'm like, I got to get this all done. I don't want to be behind. Last year I was a little bit late, so I'm like, I'm going to get it all done. So I'm not really great at math or understanding taxes, so we do have this lady that we work with that helps us, but I have to get it all organized. So she sends us this organizing thing, and I have to get through all the receipts, all the records, write everything down, and I spent all day doing it. Literally, I got to the end of the day, and as we're like getting ready to go to bed, I looked at my wife, I go, not only did I not change out of my pajamas today, I didn't shower, I didn't even brush my teeth. It was really kind of disgusting, but it honestly felt good because I hadn't done that in a long time. So I spent all day like going through that. And when you do your taxes, it's just frustrating. You're just like, how much of my money did I have to give away? And how much did I not get to use? And how much do I still, it's just frustrating. And why do you do it? Why do you do your taxes? Why do I spend all day doing my taxes? Because I'm a U.S. citizen, and being a good citizen comes with certain responsibilities. This is part of what it means to be a good citizen. Is you pay these taxes because these help our country function. Now, when I do my taxes, part of the tax planner the lady sends me is there's one section that's on charitable giving. And so I have to put in there all the records of the charitable giving we've done throughout the years. Now, one of the things that Linda and I have done is we've made this commitment that we want to live generously. And we've tried to bring our children, Jeremy and Katie, we've tried to bring them in it too. And hey, this is why we do, and this is why we give. And far and away, the most we give is to the church. We give every month. We have that set up to recurring to give. But we also give to other places. We directly support a missionary couple every month. There are different organizations, you may know, that you can sponsor children in different parts of the world. And I think currently we sponsor 4 different children, 2 in the Middle East, 1 in India, 1 in Africa. We give occasionally to just different kind of places for random reasons, for whatever. And so every year, when I do our taxes, it comes out charitable part, and I have to get all the receipts together, and this is how much we've given, and I've never regretted it. I've never one time regretted it, but I will tell you, this happens every year. Every year when I fill that out, it's a sizable chunk. It's a good portion for us. And every year when I write the number down of how much we've given in charitable giving, I always think to myself, could have bought a new car. Could have gone on some really cool vacations with that, multiple vacations. Not cool ones too. I'm not talking a little And again, I've never regretted it, but there's always that little realization of, think what we could have done. Could have redone the kitchen, could have redone all these different things. But you know why we do that? You know why Linda and I have chosen to live generously? You know why we try to help our kids to live generously? Because Jesus is king. And when Jesus is king and you live as a citizen of his kingdom, there are certain things that you do. We don't do it because we have to. We don't do it because we're trying to earn something. We don't do it because we're trying to prove something. We do it because at the core of who we are, our life is founded on this reality that Jesus died and he rose again and he has ascended and he is the king of the world. And through him, God is making the world right. And as we participate in his kingdom, we do so as citizens. And that has implications for the way that we live. Because the gospel story has become our story. See, the gospel is the good news that in fulfillment of Israel, Jesus has become king and he's making the world right. That's the good news that gives us hope. And the cool part about that is we then can become invited to be a part of that. Let me pray. Father, I thank you so much for the good news, because the good news is what allows all of us to live with hope. The good news is this reminder that no matter what it looks like, no matter what it seems like, no matter what it feels like, there is hope, because you are committed to making this world right. God, I know a lot of us have probably experienced the good news as not so good news. And I know sometimes we've even thought of the good news as not so good news. And God, the primary reason for that is because we've filtered that all through our own selfish lens. We've made it about us. And Father, I pray that today we begin to understand that the gospel isn't about us. It's about you. It's about what you're doing in this place to make your creation right, to save your creation. God, that allows us to live with hope. And one of the incredible implications of the gospel is that you have invited us to be a part of it. You've invited us to make it our story. And so God, I pray through these next several weeks as we go through these different elements of the biblical narrative, as we look at kind of these concepts that define what it is you're doing and define what the gospel is all about, that God, in that we would find where we begin to fit in. Where's our part of the gospel? Where's our part of the good news? How can we live that? How can we embody that? How can we make that story our story? Father, we pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Will you stand with me?
Your promise still stands. Great is your faithfulness, your faithfulness. Still in your hands, this is my confidence, you never fail. Your promise still stands, great is your faithfulness, your faithfulness. I'm still in your hands, this is my confidence, you never fail me yet. You've never failed me, you've failed me, Jesus. Seen you move the mountains, and I believe I'll see you do it again. Made a way when there was no way, and I believe I'll see you do it again. I've seen you move the mountains, and I believe I'll see you do it again. You made a way when there was no way, and I believe I'll see you do it again. I see you move the mountains, and I believe I'll see you do it again. You made a way when there was no way, and I believe I'll see you do it again. 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 Your promise still stands. Great is your faithfulness, your faithfulness. I'm still in your hands. This is my confidence. You never fail me. Your promise still stands. Great is your faithfulness, your faithfulness. I'm still in
So when we gather, we do two things. We worship and we try to center ourselves with God. And the second thing we do is communion. So if you're new here and you didn't receive communion on your way in, raise your hand and we'll have an usher come and find you. But yeah, communion is done as a way to remind ourselves of the first time, basically like the Last Supper is what it reminds us of. And it's when all of the friends, the disciples, came together and they ate this meal to remind themselves and just share this in communion with Jesus, who is fully God and fully man. So the bread here represents his body. So let's take that together. And the juice represents his blood that was spilled on the cross when he died for us. Let's take that together. Let's pray. God, thank you for this gift that you've given us, for dying for us, God, for dying, God, for the burial, the resurrection, God, for coming back. God, we love you so much. We're so thankful for that. You did that for us even though we didn't deserve it, God, but you love us so much and you chose to do that, God. Thank you. We're so thankful for everything that you've done in our lives, God, and we're so thankful for this opportunity to come together and remember the gift that you've given us, God. We love you so much, and in your name we pray. Amen. We love you guys so much, and if you're new, please go down to the Welcome Center. The rest of you guys will see you next week. Thank you, guys.